In this lecture, we're going to deal with some of the policy framework within the global level, at the same time at the Indian national policy framework vis-a-vis climate change and environment. So before we begin with the discussion, let us familiarize ourselves with some of the basic concepts, because oftentimes climate and weather is used interchangeably, and then there is an feeling that climate and weather are more or less the same, but they are pretty much different in the sense that how do we make sense of climate first, and then how do we understand weather for that matter. So as we all know, climate is the average daily weather which continues for an extended period of time at a given geographical topography or location. So weather in some sense reflect a very short-term conditions of the atmosphere, and it can change from period ranging from minute to minute, hour to hour, and day to day, and even from season to season. So climate is the average weather over time and space. So this has to be read as average, a typographical error here. So unlike weather, which means which is defined by this notion of temperature, rainfall, humidity of a particular time at a local area, climate on the other hand has spatial and temporal components. So it is more of like how it ranges from the time and space. So it consists of many kinds of climate consists many types of weather events and their periodicities, intensities, and also the nature of dynamism. Now, how do we make sense of climate change? So what exactly is climate change, and when we normally talk and discusses about climate change, we tend to actually take into account more than the literal changes of weather events over the time and space of that particular climate. So climate change again is a natural phenomenon, and it has been occurring since primordial time, since the very time when the earth came into being. So climate change is change in the average weather of a given area or region. So these include temperature, the very patterns of how the wind blows, and precipitation. So these change is referred to in a very in a global sense and concerns the earth is as a whole. So there is no isolated case, or there's no geographical area which haven't really experienced this phenomenon of climate change today. So even it goes across different classes and then different societies, from the urban dwellers to the rural dwellers, and the artisans, the agriculturists, fisheries, and so forth. So almost every sections of the society, for that matter, has been affected by this notion of this climate change. So some of the examples which we can sort of highlight over here is that, for instance, the changes in the ocean current, and melting of ice, which you all are familiar with. If you catch hold of a day-to-day newspaper, whether it's in media or in print, you'll come across that glaciers are actually melting at a very faster pace, and which of course has actually causes some sort of an alarming situations, and also loss of biodiversity which are included in this phenomenon of what we understood as the climate change, and they are not discussed as conventional events of weather. So such scenario and then the happening which is occurring around us are some of the things which we would be looking and discussing upon, and why does it really matters, and why we should be concerned about it. So by climate change, we also can in some sense understand the detrimental effects in environment, emissions of pollutants, the rise of temperature, precipitation change, sea level rising, because with the sea level rising we could actually see that some of the developed cities in many different countries are actually posing some kind of a threat. And we also have recurrent issues of sudden flooding and so on and so forth, and then which of course we also have witnessed over the past few decades the intensified cyclones and abrupt frequency of events. And of course we do have the anti-warning technology and information, but no doubt sometime many of these are of course being predictable, but nevertheless the intensity of these events have actually occur at a very frequent level, so to say. And ozone layer depletion, biodiversity loss such as the forest coverage, and also how many of these wildlife are actually being at threat as a consequence of the loss of biodiversity. So therefore there is an urgent need for, because in the previous classes we have been talking about some of the mechanisms or policy and laws which are actually being passed in order to conserve the biodiversity in a very appropriate and positive way. We could also change the vegetation change and the issues of drought, because there are some parts like geographical space which witness certain kinds of drought, particularly in Indian context. Over the recent times we have witnessed these drought like situations which pose an enormous threat to the farmers more importantly. So basically all these have actually bring in a lot of anomalies, at the same time a negative impact not just on the human populace but also on the animal or wildlife as a whole. So one can actually see that the overall or the overarching impact which we have witnessed as a consequence of this climate change are numerous, and it causes really havoc to the humankinds, and lives and livelihoods are being at threat. And of course there are initiatives, plans and interventions from the global and at the international level and national level. So we're going to come to that at the later part of our discussion. Now climate change is also a term that refers to the major changes in terms of the temperature and the way in which how there is for instance there are remote areas like which is considered to be one of the coldest area, but then over the few years we could actually see that people are actually feeling the brunt of these rising temperatures. The mercuries are rising, and then we can actually anticipate that people are actually using different kinds of adaptive mechanisms. and and as a consequence of which it also pose enormous problems. And we could also see the change in variations of the rainfall, because many of these traditional societies or indigenous people normally have rely on their notions of the seasonal rainfall. For instance, what crops has to be sown during the monsoon seasons, during the autumn seasons and winter, so and so forth. So with the variations or changes in this rainfall, it causes innumerable problems in terms of how their knowledge in this respect to ecology and the environment have actually being a threat. The wind patterns and all these have together cause a lasting impact on the very larger issue, and this climate change have actually linger for which could last for a decades or even longer period. So if you look at the report of the working group 2 of the intergovernmental panel on climate change, that is the IPCC, climate change is defined as any change which refers to in the climate over a period of time, whether due to a natural variability or as a result of human activity. So there is also a two-way process of explaining this climate change. One is the natural and the other is the unnatural. So the unnatural is partly because of the action of the human activities, which is man-made disasters, at the same time man-made problems which cause actually enormous impact on the contributing to the climate change as a whole. So if you look at the global scenario, that is in terms of the global climate change, which of course there is an identifiable phenomenon, that is in terms of the climate of the earth as a whole, that particularly lasts for an extended period of time, that is maybe a decades or maybe a longer duration than that. So when it is the causes are chiefly concerning the natural processes, it is usually referred to as global climate variability, and which also usually refers to changes again which is committed by the human activities that also change the atmosphere, that is excessive use of transport system, which of course the rising vehicles and then certain other amenities which are being used by the human have actually contributed to the emissions of carbon, and which eventually lead to the problems of these environmental pollutions, with ozone layer depletion and ultimately leading to climate change. Now, if we are to look at some of the issues that is concerning that what causes the Earth's climate to change, or the effects of this climate change for that matter. Now, partly we can engage this by saying that from the issues of pollutions to overpopulations are actually driving the Earth's temperature and fundamentally changing the world around us. So some of the causes which we can sort of outline for our benefits of understanding, that is the changes in the atmosphere, which of course if you consider looking at the natural processes, for example the volcanoes, the tectonic plate movement, changes in the sun, shift in the Earth's orbit. So, these are some of the natural processes which we can sort of identify it. And human activities on the other hand is an activity that releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So, this greenhouse again is an important aspect when we discuss about the way in which how it causes a lot of problem to the atmosphere. Now, if one has to situate the historical phases of this climate change, climate no doubt plays a very fundamental role in shaping the natural ecosystems and human economies and culture that particularly depend on them. Now, as we had discussed earlier, climate changes has also consequences for cases like the way in which the ocean currents and also the weather and also the food health, so and so forth. And we had also discussed that in human activities, for example, like in burning the fossil fuels, which contribute to the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, therefore, there is repeat increases in gases, particularly causing enormous pressure to the greenhouse. Now, further if we discuss continuing at the looking at the history of climate change, the climate change which we have come to expect is not what it used to be, because it have rapidly changed in the last few decades. As I had already outlined, that no doubt climate change has been witnessed since time immemorial, like since when the earth came into existence. So, one of the way in which pose a kind of alarming situation is the phenomenon of these rapid changes, because our climate is rapidly changing with disruptive impacts, and that change is pretty much advancing and progressing faster than any seen in the last 2000 years. So, which of course pose an enormous problem at the same time, an alarming situation. So, therefore, there is an urgent need and in the global level and the national level in order to take into considerations of the way in which this climate change have actually takes place. Now, if one has to further looked into by seeing that, for instance, the ice in the Greenland are actually melting at a faster pace, and which eventually lead to extra water, which led to the rise of the sea level, and it has eventually posed havoc by leading to incessant flooding and also a warmer temperature, that is extreme weather conditions, and it also lead to intense storms, snowfall, and also longer and frequent drought. Because even the cases of natural calamities like drought have actually been experienced earlier, but then the durations have actually shifted. The shifting patterns of the longevity or the longer durations of this drought. So, therefore, it in some sense pose the adaptive mechanism or coping mechanism has actually led many people or many societies or communities into a threat. So, equally, change in weather also pose challenges, that is growing of crops becomes more difficult, and the areas of plants and animals that survive. For instance, the way in which how water has diminished over a period of time. So, some of the causes of climate change, which is as a consequence of the human activities or human intervention, are outlined on the left side, and the natural processes are on the right side. So, if we go one by one, the anthropogenic causes are actually, for instance, the use of chemical fertilizers in agriculture, cropping, and so on and so forth, and also because of the timber extractions from the forest, and also because of the process of industrializations, urbanizations, we have witnessed an excessive amount of depletions of forests, eventually causing deforestation. And partly because of more land, more fresh virgin lands are actually being needed, because people want to engage in market oriented or cash cropping, which actually demands more land. So therefore we witness these cases of deforestations as well. And one could also imagine the intensity or the enormous increase of vehicles. If you visit, for instance, any nearby cities, you'd be stuck in a traffic jam, and then you could actually see the enormous amount of pollutions which it has really created, and then the carbon emission again is pretty much being filled. And on the other hand, when you looked at the natural causes of climate change, we have sunspot and solar cycles, the ocean currents, forest fire, and volcanic eruptions and meteorites. So in some sense, these natural causes are something beyond the control of the human society. But on the other hand, the anthropogenic causes to some extent can be controlled by the human societies, because human alone are responsible for all this. Now we often talk about like, for example, global warming, right? Because of the rising temperatures, so and so forth. So the gradual increase in the overall temperatures of the Earth's atmosphere due to the greenhouse effect. Okay, so this effect is again caused by increased level of CO2 and other gases in the air, and many of them actually being released by the human activity. So greenhouse effect actually is the problem which is caused by the increased quantities of gases, particularly the CO2 and others in the air. So these gases which are being trapped, that is the heat from the sun, and also causes a gradual rise in the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. Now, as we had discusses the use of for example the chemical fertilizers for that matter. So adding to these new agriculture challenges, that is, all this can actually directly affect the human physical health, that is because of the use of chemical fertilizers. And mostly in urban areas there is also an increased amount of smoke, and it contains ozone particles. So exposure to higher levels of smoke causes enormous health problems like asthma, heart disease, and even the lung cancer. So the rapid rate of climate change is caused by humans in particular, and also the one who can contact it. So one can, for example, also looked at or situate this that since when these rapid problems of this climatic change are being witnessed. So since the period of this industrial revolution, which began in the mid 18th century, that human activities have contributed substantially to climate change by adding CO2 and other heat trapping gases into the atmosphere. So these green gas emissions have increased the greenhouse effect, causing the Earth's surface temperature. Now, looking into a bit of the nature or of how this Earth's temperature actually depends on the balance between energy entering and leaving the planet system. So usually when the incoming energy that is from the sun is absorbed by the Earth system, the Earth actually get warms, right? So which is being absorbed and which cause certain kinds of some amount of heat. So when the sun's energy is reflected back into space, Earth avoids warming. So when the absorbed energy is released back into space, the Earth cools. But the problem arises when the absorbed energy is not being adequately released back into space, then the temperature on the Earth's surface in some sense has remained warm, and then the way in which how it is the drawbacks is not there. So many factors including both natural and human can actually cause changes in the Earth's energy balance, including the variations in the sun's energy reaching the Earth, and also changing in the reflectivity of the Earth's atmosphere and surface, and changes in the greenhouse effect, which affect the amount of heat retained by the Earth's atmosphere. So these factors have actually caused the Earth's climate to change in a different interval and of time and space frequently and in a regular basis. So if you look at the way in which how climate change have actually taken place prior to the industrial revolutions, that is in the 18th century, can actually be explained by the natural causes, that is such as changes in the solar energy, volcanic eruptions, and natural changes in the greenhouse gas concentrations. However, recent climate changes cannot be explained merely by these natural causes, as most research indicate that natural causes do not explain most observed warming since the mid 20th century. So humans are actually the anthropogenic interventions are increasingly influencing the climate and also the Earth's temperature by engaging in burning the fossil fuels, cutting down rainforest, and also the farming livestocks. Now we have also outlined that some of the anthropogenic activities which might have possibly contributed to the greenhouse effect. Now if we take one of the simple examples, for instance a plastic bottle that is which I mean microplastics takes 1000 agonizing years to be decomposed. So, one could actually see that many of the oceans are actually becoming a garbage dumping space, and posing not just to the water bodies, also to the wildlife which are dependent on these water bodies, because animals like the seabirds get entangled in the mass of waste. And you could also sometimes see in the news that where sea mammals like dolphins because of excessive consumptions of those garbage plastic materials have actually being endangered, and then the life are being at threat. So other sea animals, for instance the sea turtles, are choking on it, and also the mistakes of the use of these plastics for food, and also without being able to consume the other edible items, have actually the sea mammals actually have starved to death. So this also in some sense affect our food chain system, because what we normally do actually comes back, because the microplastics are found in every forms of our food, and every single day what we consumed is actually what we normally dumped back, or a consequence or the activities of the humankind. So these are some of the anthropogenic causes of how we as a human without carelessly engage in all this. So these human activities what we have discussed, for instance by citing examples of dumping plastic bottles or garbage to the water bodies, have actually led to a release of large amounts of the CO2, which of course again is the primary greenhouse gas, in addition to those naturally occurring in the atmosphere, and then increasing the greenhouse effect and the global warming. Now scientists have known that CO2 is one of the main greenhouse gases of importance to the Earth's energy balance. Since CO2 is also one of the main greenhouse gases of importance to the Earth's energy balance, and it is also again already in the atmosphere naturally, and why are emissions from human activity significant. So human activities have significantly disturbed the natural carbon cycle by extracting the long buried fossil fuels and burning them to energy, thus releasing CO to the atmosphere. So you could see some of these rising issues, and a diagram over here that is the greenhouse effects, how it is being the processes in which it is being done. So the incoming solar radiation here reaches the surface of the earth, and it is again absorbed by the atmosphere, and ideally it has to be reflected back to the space. So one can actually see that how these the greenhouse effect actually occurs, and then it sort of play out. The sun's radiations that strikes the Earth's atmosphere in the form of light is called the ultraviolet radiation and the infrared radiation chiefly. So the ultraviolet radiation has a shorter wavelength and a higher energy level than the visible light, while the infrared radiation has a longer wavelength and a weaker energy level. So 30% of the radiation striking the Earth's atmosphere immediately reflected back to the space by clouds, ice, snow, sand, and other reflective surfaces. Now we have also cases of the melting of the polar ice sheets and glaciers, and these large ice formations like the glaciers, the polar ice caps naturally melt back a bit each summer. So that's the very natural processes. But in the winter, the snows made primarily from the evaporated seawater are generally sufficient to balance out the melting. Higher temperatures caused by the global warming have actually led to a greater than average summer melting, as well as it eventually led to the diminishing of the snowfall due to late winters and also our early springs. So there is this seasonal variations and which actually hamper the natural flows of the ice formations. So increased heat is also causing the massive ice sheets that cover, for instance, the Greenland and the Antarctica to melt at a very fast pace. So scientists have actually believed that meltwater from above and seawater from below is seeping beneath the Greenland's and West Antarctica's ice sheets, which cause them to prove more quickly into the sea. So as a consequence of which we have these issues of the increase in the sea level, which eventually lead to the flooding and erosion of the coastal and also the low-lying areas. So the two major causes of the global sea level are again the thermal explosion, which are caused by warming of the oceans, since water expands at its warms, and also the loss of land-based ice such as glaciers and ice sheets due to the increased melting. So we have actually witnessed an extreme weather, that is flooding, forest fires, wildfires, drought, and heat waves. So some of the effect which have been witnessed so far in terms of the climate change are the extinction of species, because as a consequence of the rising temperature or maybe the increasing speeds of the meltdown of glaciers, and also maybe because of deforestations, we have actually seen that many species are being endangered and are actually being extinct. So the acidifications of ocean again is causing a problem to the species which are dependent on the water bodies, and also to extractions of drinking waters to which are not really conducive for drinking. And it also poses a lot of challenges to health issues, which I have already pointed out, that in terms of the very way in which the immune systems of the human body are actually weak, and which have posed a lot of threat to the health. The ocean temperatures are rising and also lead to people who are people and wildlife migrations, and eventually also lead to a lot of conflict. So we have in the preceding lectures we talk about the ecological refugees, or we also talk about like people who are being displaced, and which have actually caused a lot of issues with regards to migrations and also conflict. So people migrate in order to find better avenues or greener pastures for the animals, and we could actually see a lot of cases of migrations and conflict arising as a consequence of which. And oxygen depletion, because as we all know, we human need oxygen like more than anything else in order to survive. So the depletions of this oxygen actually, for instance, pollutions have led to depletions of oxygen, and we could actually see that people are being choked, and it becomes really next to impossible to even survive. So the water sources are also changing. As a consequence, we could also see that many of the natural lakes and then springs are actually drying up as a consequence of climate change. So, and we could also see the shifting the shifting of the rivers instance, for instance, like because of the sudden flooding, like the course of the river actually changes, so thereby impacting the agricultural land nearby, and then also the human populace. So sometimes it also lead to the washing away of the human inhabitants and also other issues. And the natural disasters like the tsunamis and then the certain other which we have seen in recent times actually cause a lot of havoc, because the intensity is pretty much high, and the tolls and the problems which we have witnessed is more than anything else much more higher than what we have seen in the past. So these are the likely future effects because of the climate change. First is the warming and sea level rise will no doubt continue, and will probably occur more frequently and then what we have already witnessed up till now. So even if we sort of attempts to stabilize the greenhouse gases, this will possibly continue to occur for centuries. So some of the marks will be remained permanently, and then it will be sort of like in unavoidable. So the effects on ecosystems, that is the coral system and other unique ecosystems cannot handle higher temperature well, and wildfires will also increase, because many of the forests are actually drying up, and then we could actually witness incessant problems of this wildfire. So 30% of the species will be at increased risk for extinction due to the rapid changes in their ecosystem. So we have reached a point that where it is important for us to unite to tackle some of these issues. Therefore, the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972 have actually happens to be one of the landmark beginning, that is at the 1972 United Nations Conference on Human Environment. We have actually seen a lot of think tanks across different countries and coming together to sort of initiate one of the problems which is being encountered. So even the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's speech in that particular conference initiated an intellectual tradition in Indian climate policy that pits socio-economic development against environmental protection and accuses the developed countries of the North for causing global environmental problems. So, we also have the Vienna Convention for Protections of the Ozone Layer, that is in 1985, and also the Montreal Protocol in 1987, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 1988, and the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development in 1992, and the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. So, so far in this, the IPCC sort of comes to a certain conclusions that their effects, that is those of the human caused greenhouse gases together with those of other anthropogenic drivers, have been detected throughout the climate systems and are extremely likely to have been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid 20th century. So, this is perhaps one of the outcome of the IPCC. Now, if you look into the the history of the climate negotiations, climate change negotiation in the Stockholm meet in 1972, those concerning issues on environment related were being raised, and in 1974 again the UN World Food Conference in Rome recognized the central role of climate in the world food production. And also in 1976, the UN World Water Conference was held in Argentina, and in 1979, in response to the extreme climatic events, WMO, UNEP and FAO, UNESCO and WHO convened the first World Climate Conference in Geneva. So, again in 1987, in the Montreal Protocol on restricting the use of chemicals that damage the ozone layer. So, these urging needs or issues were actually being raised. So, again in 1988, which of course is a historical year for climate change negotiations, which eventually led to the formations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, jointly by the United Nations Environment Program and also the World Meteorological Organizations, that is WMO. So, this provide these negotiations or this particular meet again in 1988 provide the world with a clear scientific view on the current state of knowledge in climate change and its potential environmental and socio-economic impacts. So, in 1990, the IPCC's first assessment report was released, and IPCC and second World Climate Conference called for a global treaty on the climate change. So, in 1990, again the United Nations General Assembly negotiations on a framework convention actually began. So, these are some of the historical negotiations or the history of climate change negotiations which have actually taken place, and the issues which have been being raised. So, in 1992 again the Rio summit was held, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is opened for signature. So over here the developed countries have accept responsibilities for the overwhelming majority of emissions and aim to stabilize those particularly the CO2 emissions at 1990 levels by the year 2000, and the countries obliged to report emissions voluntary in nature and focus on mitigation. So 1994 again the UNFCCC enters into force, and one of the ultimate objective of the convention is to achieve in accordance with the relevant provisions of the convention stabilizations of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at the level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, to enable economic development to produce in a sustainable manner. So this is the sort of commitment and the ultimate objective of the convention being held. So some of the principles of the convention, that is the first and foremost, that is the precautionary principle, that is the lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as an excuse to postpone action when there is actually a threat to serious or irreversible changes. So principles of common but differentiated responsibilities, that is the CBDR and respective capabilities, the developed countries parties should actually take the lead in combating the climate change and also the adverse effects thereof. So also they sort of subscribe to carrying forward the principles of sustainable development, that is policies and measures to protect the climate system should be appropriate for the specific conditions of each party and should be integrated with the national development programs. So again in 1995 the IPCC second assessment report was released, and the first conference of the parties, that is COP1, takes place in Berlin. So the first conference of the parties made up the signatories of the UNFCCC, which acknowledges that the UNFCCC is inadequate without country specific commitments. So far there is no commitment on the part of those who are part of these parties. So it agrees to negotiate emission reduction targets for the industrialized or developed countries. So again in 1996 the conference of the second conference of the parties was held in Geneva. So the COP3 was held in Kyoto in 1997, which is popularly known as the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol agreement included flexibility mechanisms, and it focuses more on the mitigation part. So flexibility mechanism that would allow the industrialized nations to get credit for actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in other countries. So in other words, those industrialized countries or developed nations have actually need to help out the developing or the underdeveloped countries in terms of cutting down this carbon emissions, and then they will be sort of being credited for this work. Now, what does this Kyoto Protocol envisage? It sort of attempts to target some of the important points, such as the 5.2 reduction of emission levels below 1990 levels by 2008 to 12 for all the industrialized countries, and specific targets for various countries, which is given here, the US -7%, and then it goes on to Iceland plus 10%. So 6 greenhouse gases considered, that is the CO2, CH4, N2O and HFC are some of the identified as the 6 greenhouse gases. So the talks of the 6th conference on the parties, the COP in the Hague collapsed, and the IPCC released its 3rd assessment report. So in 2001, in the Conference of Parties met for the seventh time, and adopted which focuses on adaptation. So the final elements of the Kyoto Protocol are actually being strengthened and hammered out here. So the US, particularly the developed countries, the US, Canada, Japan and Australia, forced the European Union to accept measure concessions in order to reach the final agreement. So in 2001, 2 months after his inauguration, the US President George W. Bush announces US withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol, which remained one of the major setback. So in 2007, the IPCC's 4th assessment report was released, and in 2009, that is the Conference of Parties 15th was ratified in the Copenhagen Accord. So the Group 8 countries agreed that 2 degrees of Celsius of average global warming is actually a limit which should not be exceeded. So to reach this particular goal, global greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced by at least 50% by 2050, and emissions from the developed countries should be reduced by 80% or more. So 2014, again, the first part of the IPCC's 5th assessment report says that scientists are 95% certain that humans are dominant cause of this global warming since the period 1950s. So this is one of the revelations, and then there is an urging need on the findings of the scientists. So there is also a fund which is being drawn for a green climate fund, and $100 billion year by 2020. Developed countries commit this fund to invest in mitigations, adaptations and technology. Now coming to India's climate change policy. Now, as I had pointed out that the National Action Plan on Climate Change was released on 30th June 2008 to state India's contributions towards combating climate change. So the plan outlines 8 national missions running through 2017, and it outlines measures on climate change related adaptations and mitigations while simultaneously advancing development. So, the plans consist of an overview and technical document. So, GHG generated through long-term and intensive industrial growth and high consumptions of lifestyle in developed countries. Now, in the build up to Rio summit in 1992, the ideological foundations of India's climate policy were further laid down in an influential report by Center for Science and Environment called Global Warming in an Unequal World, which accused developed countries of carbon colonialism. So, the report argued that developed countries bear the bulk of the responsibility for climate change given their historical emissions, and that the per capita allocation of emissions should be the metric for dividing responsibility of for climate mitigation. So, it is important at this point to provide some numbers which set India's position in appropriate scientific context. So, if climate change is considered a problem of stock of greenhouse gas emissions, that is the total emissions build up over time, which has a finite ceiling to limit temperature rise, then India bears little responsibility. So, a study of the carbon house gas emissions from 1850 to 2012 concluded that cumulative emissions in that period from the USA, European Union and China will contribute to 50% of the temperature increase by 2100, with emissions from the US, EU and China being 20%, 17% and 12% respectively, whereas India's emissions in that same period contributed to just 5%. Now, given that India's climate change policy sort of maintained a high growth rate to improve standard of living and also reducing their vulnerability to the impacts of the climate change, because India continues to remain a poor country by the global standards, with a third of the population below the poverty line. And if you look at the GDP, because India's GDP again is pretty much low. So, on the other hand, if climate change is viewed through a different temporal lens and analyzed as a problem of current and future, so greenhouse gas flows, India is the world's third largest emitter with the rising emissions, and therefore matters significantly to climate action. So, it also attempts to promote developmental objectives, also yielding co-benefits for addressing climate change effects. So, these are some of the initiatives which are being taken as a consequence to cutting down the carbon emissions and also framing some of the climate change policy. Now, following on from Rio, that is, India continued to play an active role in global climate negotiations, and its efforts were actually seen as crucial to securing the Berlin Mandate in 1995 again. So, for instance, when we talk about this national solar mission, so to make the solar energy competitive with fossil based energy options, and also by increasing the share of solar energy in the total energy mix, it aims to empower people at the grassroots level. So also to engage in launching R&D program, facilitating international cooperations, and also to enable the creation of affordable or more convenient solar energy systems and the solar thermal power generations, and then various other technology transfer and capacity building. So we also have these national missions for enhanced energy efficiency in industries. So the Energy Conservation Act of 2001 provides a legal mandate for the implementations of energy efficiency measures through the mechanisms of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. So it aims to saving up to 10,000 megawatt by the 11th five-year plan of 2012. So it sort of like envisages shifting to energy saving appliances and also develop a fiscal instruments to promote energy efficiency. So the national missions on sustainable habitat attempts to promote energy efficiency in the residential, both in the residential and the commercial sector, and energy efficient building and building components, and the use of energy efficient appliances, and recycling of materials is again an important option for reducing the environmental pressure. So also the promotion of urban public transport, so that the use of individuals or private cars are being literally cut down. So therefore an extensive use of mass transport system is to be encouraged, and also the use of a CNG, that is a compressed natural gas, which will eventually cut down the use of diesel in many of the commercial vehicles, which of course is one of the main causes for the emissions of CO2. And also the promotion of the biodiesel production. We also have the jatropha plantations and then various other biodiesel production programs which are being pushed forward by the many of the government policies and program. So the promotions of development of hydrogen power vehicles is also one of the national mission on sustainable habitat. So we have again the national water mission, that by 2050 India is likely to predicted to be a water scarce, which we of course are facing the brunt even now. So the mission aims at conserving water, minimizing wastage, and ensuring more equitable distributions of management of water resources. So it also aims to optimize water use efficiency by 20% by developing a framework of regulatory mechanisms. So studies on management of surface water resources and also management and regulations of groundwater resources, and also upgrading the storage structure for fresh water and drainage system for wastewater. And conservation of wetland again is important, because we could actually witness that across the country that many of the wetlands are being lost as a consequence of the housing areas, urbanizations, and then various other development activities. So which also have caused enormous threats in terms of causing flooding, which are of course man-made in that sense. We also have this national mission for sustaining the Himalayan ecosystem. Again, the Himalayan ecosystem is very much integral to the biodiversity of the country. So as a consequence of increase in temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, drought, and also the melting of glaciers are some of the obvious threats which we have witnessed. So therefore missions calls for empowering the local communities, especially the panchayats, the local authorities, to play a greater role in managing ecological resources. So in other words, it encourages the community-based natural resource management. We'll be discussing some of these issues in the next lecture. So by taking the cases of these the Himalayan ecosystem, why many of their biodiversity are under threat as a consequence of this climate change and all. So the National Mission for Sustaining the Himalayan Ecosystem also envisages to adopt appropriate land use planning and also watershed management for the mountain ecosystem. So the National Mission for a Green India also tries to develop or give utmost importance in terms of the afforestation policies, that forest meets 40% of the overall energy needs of the country and 80% of that in rural India. So therefore, the effort would be to increase in forest cover and density. So the final target is also to bring 1/3 of India's geographic area under the forest cover, and of course engage in conserving biodiversity. So we also have these initiatives such as the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, that is to improve the dryland, mitigate or try to engage in dryland agriculture, development of drought and pest resistance crops, improving methods of conserving soil and water, and also financial supports to those farmers to adopt climate resistant technology, risk management, strengthening of agriculture and weather insurance scheme, use of GIS for soil mapping, pest and disease hotspots, and also access information such as development of regional database of soil, weather, genotype, land use pattern, and also water resources, and also use of biotechnology, that is by the development of crops with better water and nitrogen use efficiency. So finally, the National Mission on Strategic Knowledge for Climate Change, that is to engage in the climate modeling and access to data, that is to enhance research on climatic modeling in India. So a number of these government agencies collecting a wide spectrum of data, but data sharing no doubt is difficult. So again, to emphasize on strengthening networks and also creations of these integrations of knowledge network and various other schemes. So this is the readings you can perhaps refer, so that we could have much more ideas about some of the policy interventions at the global and the national level, and also the national action plan which are being initiated to sort of look forward to cater the action plan for this climate change. So I'll stop here. Thank you.